Hello everyone, my name is Professor Pat Dudgeon. I'm a research professor here with the School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Western Australia.
What is your relationship to the Working Together book?
I'm one of the editors of the Working Together book. I also co-authored many of the chapters in it, so I have a very close relationship with that book.
What were the circumstances like when you edited and wrote the book? Was it difficult, challenging? Are there any stories?
Look, it was very difficult at the time. There wasn't a textbook like that around, and we had a lot of expectations. So we're talking about the second edition. We'd already done a first edition, but with the second edition, we even firmed up what we wanted from the book, and to have Indigenous knowledges portrayed, to have Indigenous leadership and governance over the whole book was very important for us. So in our work, my background is in psychology, and Helen, the other editor, is in psychiatry. So in a lot of our work, we're often asked to give, to share information or resources on what was appropriate for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander clients and people. So this was an opportunity for us to bring all those resources together and to get together this great book that would be useful for our area. But underneath that, we also wanted to have Indigenous people speaking for themselves or writing for themselves. So I think the combination that we were profiling new programs that were community-based, but we covered, the whole gamut of mental health, social and emotional wellbeing, suicide prevention. It was a sort of skim across a lot of the different topics, but it was an opportunity to profile some community programs and to capacity build and value those Indigenous professionals who were writing in the area at the time. So I think that back then, nowadays I'm involved in a lot of other publications, and we talk about Indigenous knowledges and, protocols about who should be leading research and the publications of papers. And it's commonplace. But back then, we didn't have any guidelines. We knew what felt right for us and set our course and achieved it very well. Having said that, it's a big book with a whole lot of different authors on different topics, so I think that was a challenge in itself. So to ensure that we brought everyone through and it was completed.
The second edition of Working Together was published in 2014. What was the discourse around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and wellbeing at the time?
Oh, look, I think that until then, there were little areas where people were more progressive in their thinking, but basically we saw as being, for Indigenous mental health and wellbeing, it was seen as, slotting under mainstream, and some topics do. But I think that it's important that that we speak to and hear from the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people who are working in the field and who are writing about what's important for their communities or their programs that they're doing. So I think there was less of that when back when we did the book. So us able to having the ability to profile those programs and services was really important, and really validating to the people who were writing the chapters. They were really proud about that. So we also validated their knowledge themselves and their knowledges and what they were doing. So to me, that's an important distinction as well. But having said that, there were chapters where there was a mix of authors. There were chapters on the social determinants of health. There were chapters on the clinical elements of health, mental health. So it covered a whole wide gambit of different needs, and I think it did it rather well. Nowadays, there's a lot more information there's a lot more community-led programs and knowledges and research, But back in those days, and that's only 10 years ago, it was unusual. So I think we were part of being part of a big change that happened, and a good change that happened. So we were really pleased to do the book. And I think most importantly, it's proved to be useful. So I'm sure the other editors will say that when we go out and about, a lot of people come up and say to us, that was our Bible, you know, in the area, because it gave you this textbook that covered a whole range of different areas. And it's still current now.
How do you think the discourse has changed in the intervening 10 years?
Okay, the discourse has changed significantly, not only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but for mainstream as well. I think there's more, for instance, in suicide prevention, my understanding is that it was perceived as an individual issue and a clinical issue, and it was almost like the victims were blamed themselves in the way we approached it and researched it. But there's very much now an acknowledgement of the role of social determinants and how these contribute to suicide in this instance. So I think a lot has changed. First of all, you know, words like cultural responsiveness, you know, Indigenous governance, Indigenous leadership in all research matters that has changed significantly. There's still probably pockets where it still needs to change, so it's not a total change, but certainly the spaces I occupied, I've seen a great change. So that's for me, that's the big changes that have happened. I think self-governance, self-determination are very much a part of any conversation that we have. I know that soon after the book was published, we were engaged in this big research project looking at what should we do about addressing Indigenous suicide. And even though we went out and did workshops across Australia, and even though communities knew that there were clinical issues that needed to be addressed, for them the most important thing was self-determination, that they needed to be in charge of their own programs and their own issues. So I think I've seen a lot of policy, a lot of projects that have brought that around. And for any group of people, particularly those who have been marginalised, they need to be part of the decision making about, you know, what resources go into their services and how those services operate. Otherwise, you know, you're not meeting the needs of your client group.
How do you place the Working Together book in the wider context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mental health and wellbeing in Australia?
The Working Together book is still the most significant text in Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. So we know that the first edition went out quickly, the second edition as well. Even though it's 10 years old, and this area does change, you know, quickly and significantly, it's still current. So I think that now it provided an overview of different topic areas, and the time's come for us to do research into those areas and with the community, and to start drilling down and getting more knowledges about things that are happening, our well-being, you know, the causes and the solutions of Indigenous mental health. So it still remains a significant text, and it still has its philosophical underpinnings. And we took those from the Ways Forward report, and self-determination certainly is one of those. But also, you know, to get the best of both worlds and to ensure that, you know, that we did look through at any identification, treatment and intervention on Indigenous mental health through a cultural lens as well.
If we look at your chapters that you co-authored, what were some of the themes and topics, and who did you work with on those chapters?
Okay, so for me, I know this sounds a bit odd now saying it, but from the very first edition of the Working Together book, to put together the history so that our history shapes us to what we are now. and to put that together and say, you know, the situation as we are now has some historical context, and you can't go through a process of colonisation without consequences, and to still acknowledge that there's still racism and disadvantage for a lot of our people, and that's going to impact on their well-being. So I think the history chapter was probably the most important one for me, and had to be a part of it, part of the Working Together books in both editions. But in the second edition, we saw the emergence of the social emotional wellbeing discussion. So that was really important as well. And that was a group of Indigenous psychologists coming together, working on existing resources. So there had been existing work done, but they put that together in a diagram in a way that anyone in the community could understand. So I think that was a bit of a paradigm shift too. The people who'd come, the Ways Forward report and Indigenous health leaders in the past were saying, you know, things have to be, we need holistic approaches, we need self-determination, we need cultural solutions as well. But to put that together and package it up, you know, into that social emotional wellbeing diagram, which is used everywhere. So it's proved to be really useful, and that was our intent when we did that chapter. We actually met and locked ourselves in and worked on it, and we'd tested it already, the prototype of it, with in a conference of Indigenous mental health workers, and they're pretty critical. If they don't like it or they thought it was rubbish, they'd say so. So we had already tested it. So I think that for me personally has emerged as one of the most valuable offerings to our community, and in the whole discourse of Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. We also have other models there, like Helen Milroy's Dance of Life, and I think that's the glorious things. While we all, you know, we straddle both worlds, but we also offer programs and models that might be a bit more appropriate for our people. So that's probably the biggest reward that I've got from the book. The impact of the Working Together book has been quite profound. I think that, you know, the feedback we've had, I know that for some mental health or psychology programs or even health programs, it's a core text, so that's important for us too. So it's widely used, very widely used. And I think for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students to have that book has been really important. And if we did count up, you know, the number of times when people have come to myself, Helen and Roz, and said, you know, thank you for that book. It saved my life and it made my studies so much easier. And for the Aboriginal community too, I was a mental health commissioner for a few years, and we went and visited a lot of communities, and I always saw the Working Together book in the Aboriginal community. So in their stack of books you'd always see our Working Together book. So I think its usefulness has been very reassuring for us. So we've appreciated that it was useful, and hopefully you know, it certainly opened doors for some of the authors who may not have got a chance to publish their work. So I hope that's benefited them. But more people who were studying in the area, whether they were Indigenous or non-Indigenous, it provided something different. And from an Indigenous lens as well.
Do you think you could talk a little bit more about the variety of people that use the book? So you mentioned students, but also...
I think the use has been good. I still see it flagged as a resource in cultural competence training. So it was certainly, the Indigenous psychs were engaged in this big cultural competence training program, and it was a core text for them. It's a core text in a lot of university programs and for Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal professionals working in the area. So it's had good use across the board. So yeah, it's had a pretty big effect.
Sure. Do you think, are there any ways of thinking from the book that were pioneered by working together and or are even more relevant today?
I think the paper on social emotional wellbeing was a pioneering paper. That now, that dialogue is relatively commonplace. There's other chapters. I think Clinton Schultz led a paper where they talked about the workforce, and he put together a really great diagram, which we still use now. So I'm involved in some policy making groups, and we still use that original diagram of what a great workforce team would look like for Indigenous mental health and wellbeing. So I think, no one's come up with a better one yet, a better model, say, for the workforce. So I think that it did, people, they were very experienced, they were practitioners, and they drew upon all that they were also very conscious that, we wanted to make things culturally appropriate. So all that experience and wisdom came into the book. So I feel that there were pioneering elements of it. Those two spring to mind. I'm sure others speaking might see other things. Obviously, I favour certain things in the book. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts or messages for the upcoming generation of researchers, writers, health professionals?
Oh, look, big messages for upcoming authors and researchers. I think that it is important for you to think about things. It's a different world nowadays. When I was studying psych, there's hardly anything on different cultural groups. Nowadays, we do have much more acknowledgement and recognition of the diversity that makes up any discipline. So, value your Indigenous knowledge and write it up, get it published. And non-Indigenous researchers, look at how to do culturally appropriate research with Indigenous people. And don't be afraid to do it too. If you've got a good idea and you've got a good Aboriginal bunch of colleagues or a service that wants you to work with them, consider doing it, but do it in a way that empowers Indigenous people and is of use to our community. Things have changed. When we did the second edition, it was quite different to the first edition. We were using terms like the history of colonisation, invasion, which are the realities. They're realities for Indigenous people, not only here in Australia, but globally. And the government was very uncomfortable with that. They were looking to say it in a nicer way, if one can say it in a nicer way. Later they accepted that those words need to be written because they were the opinions of the authors, but they were very uncomfortable with those terms. And I think that our position was, I'm going to get too radical. So I think that things have changed now. The government wouldn't even blink an eyelid, but it was important that we came from a decolonising standpoint too. So that was part of what we had to do. I won't wrap it on. I could wrap it on more, but I won't.